Hello, welcome to another edition of my Clarendon Chronicles podcast. And my returning guest today is Ewen Murchison, back by popular demand and my most downloaded episode of my podcast series one. Ewen, you may recall, is a retired Major General, one of the highest ranks in the UK Royal Marines, with a distinguished career marked by global service in high pressure situations. And drawing on his extensive military experience, he now performs advisory roles across multiple corporate organizations or through his own performance coaching company and working with others, offering a unique perspective on leadership, responsibility, culture, and what we're really going to focus upon today, teamwork. Ewen, thank you so much for joining us again today. And as mentioned at the top of the program, your first podcast was the most popular episode in my first series. And there's been an incredible demand to hear much more about the work that you do in corporate based on the work that you did in the military and how we can all learn from that. So, Ewen, may I start by this discussion by extending perhaps our previous conversation around your work with the Centre for Team Excellence. First of all, like many of us who think we work as a team, in actual fact, you and I both know that we simply don't. We see this in business, we see it in sport, many other areas, and it's a major failing. Why do you think teams are or become dysfunctional, and how did you manage to foster the team environment in the military, Ewen?
So, Jeremy, nice to be here again. Thank you very much for inviting me back, and good afternoon to everyone of the listeners. Thank you for that question. So, one of my start points for when I work with teams nowadays is to really understand what the root causes are in corporates in particular, and that's slightly different, in my view, from what symptoms are, Jeremy. So, when I'm talking about root causes, I'm talking about things like competing priorities. Which not only causes confusion, but can lead to competition amongst different people. Incentives is always a very thorny issue in corporates because quite often people are incentivized individually, whereas you need to have sort of group incentives for the team to work in harmony. You can have personality clashes, egos and power dynamics all at play, and there's all sorts of unspoken expectations. What I talk about, issues under the table, issues that are not being brought onto the table in a transparent way. So those are some of the root causes that I see of dysfunction in teams. And of course, dysfunction can be about efficiency, where it's just about productivity and use of resources, but it can also be a lack of effectiveness, which is much more about outcomes and how people work together. And to answer your question about the military, one of the things that we really differentiated between, if you like, was this idea of team and tribe. So a team felt very functional and practical and goal orientated with lots of performance metrics around it, whereas a tribe feels much more about belonging, psychological connection, emotional connection. We use words like kin and clan and community. I was part of the Royal Marines tribe for 30 years. So even though I had lots of different teams, it's that sort of tribal context, that emotional connection, which is one of the key things I learned in the military and I then try to bring to corporates.
And it's that kind of thing, Ewen, the areas there, which I'm sure the listeners will have spotted straight away, the dysfunction between the I and the we, the dysfunction between the incentives, perhaps the lack of input that we see and hear about creating the team environment. It still feels like in corporate world, that's something which is a bit too fluffy, and that we should all just take it upon ourselves to do our own thing. And why then should it be a surprise that the whole team and the system around us is just not working at all? And so, as you say, some of those symptoms, some of those exhibits of how a team isn't functioning, I'm sure will resonate really well with the audience. So, I mean, Ewen, when a team's functioning well, that might be evident. But if a team's not performing well, you saw, how in corporate world do we see the evidence of perhaps even where people say they're acting as a team, but the evidence suggests not. What are we looking for as leaders that say this isn't working? The team environment, the tribe isn't there.
I'll answer that first by saying that when you see a well-functioning team, you can feel it. You can feel it in simple ways, like people are showing up for meetings early. People are staying behind after meetings to have positive conversations. There's no one hoarding knowledge and information in a way that is sort of problematic. There's laughter amongst the group. There's fun in the way that people are actually going about their work, and issues that are potentially big issues are being dealt with in a very open and transparent way. So when you come across a team that's functioning well, you recognize it, you see it, you feel it. On the other hand, I mean, Patrick Lencioni still gives you the best model of the dysfunctions of a team, and we were the readers will know what we're talking about here, of a lack of trust, fear of conflict and challenge, a lack of commitment, a lack of accountability, and then a focus on individual rather than team results. So any one of those can be going on in the team at a given one time, and that will have an impact, and that will cause the dysfunction that you're talking about.
And I recognise that, and I talked about Lencioni on my own executive education courses as well. Is it possible to correct it? So you will undoubtedly, as I have been in a situation where the team displays all those characteristics of being dysfunctional or could get better. Is it correctable? Is it able to be turned around? And at what point do you think I've invested enough in turning it around and I have to do something different?
So I think in any environment where a coach or a consultant is brought in, the team or the group want and need to be helped. They need to accept themselves that there's some improvement that can be done. And I think, therefore, one of the first steps I often do is, you try and diagnose the problem. You just say, what are the top 3 things that are making your job really difficult today? Make it, drop to the level of the people that you're interacting with and intervening with. And I think that's a simple diagnosis like that will go a long way. But the number one thing, Jeremy, that I find in helping teams is, some people call it terms of reference, some people call it a team charter, but just this idea of very clear purpose and roles for that group of people. Because again, when people come to a board meeting, they're probably often representing the department or the team that they are the leader of, and they're then coming to champion their cause around the board. But if there's a sense of collective responsibility and ownership of that group, that team, then you've got to, and you haven't got a charter, then you've got nothing to hold each other accountable for. You've got no standards around which to base the conversations. So just by being really super clear about the purpose and roles of that team and how it is going to function, and who we are together, and how we expect each other to interact with one another, that will go a long way to setting the conditions for success.
And I would entirely agree with that. And I take that into my own coaching and mentoring as well. And I came up with coaching with purpose. And when people have asked me, what do you mean? What's this coaching with purpose? I said, well, it's really clear for me, because if I've been asked, for example, to coach individuals, and I've been coaching individuals in the same organization as well, I go right back. And in fact, I did my dissertation on this, in saying, what are the terms of reference of the coaching? What are you actually trying to achieve? And is it aligned with the objectives of the organization? So unless everything is lined up for me, I actually go back to potential clients and say, this might not work, or it might need some more work on the engagement stage, because it's unclear in one of those areas as to what you're trying to achieve. It might be contradictory to the vision or the mission or the values of the organization. And coaching individuals might be the case that they can improve individually, but their system around them is going to prevent them getting further. So I think this really resonates with me as well. And I hosted another podcast recently with an academic, Dr. Darren Stevens, and he created constructive development theory. And he described it as any one point in time, there are cognitive intentions and pairs of cognitive intentions that are contradictory. And perhaps one of the easiest ones to reference is you've got people in your team, some of whom may be individuals in terms of the way they think, and some of them are automatically team players in terms of the way that they think. How, as a leader, do we deal with that? Are they totally incompatible, or can you harness the advantages of both?
So I think this is where, Jeremy, we jump into this idea of identity leadership versus traditional leadership. So traditional leadership is about me as the leader, how I perform in a given situation. It's very trait-based, it's quite autocratic and directive. Whereas identity leadership is much more of a relational process. And it acknowledges the fact that a leader cannot be a leader. A leader does not exist unless there are followers. And the leaders and followers coexist, and it's much more relational. So this is your point you made about it changes the conversation from me to we and from I to us. So, the leader needs to harness the group in such a way, often through shared identity, to get all the different voices speaking together. And actually, there's a chap called Professor Haslam who came up with a model. He called it the CARE model, which is a really interesting way how leaders can sort of shape and reinforce and leverage this identity to the benefit of the team. And it just, if I may, it has four quick elements to it. It's about creating a sense of us. So leading conversations about who we are together. It's about advancing us. So standing up for and championing your group. It's about representing us. So it's about role modeling and embodying the standards and values of the group. And then it's about embedding us. So developing the systems and processes that allow who we are together. So the job of the leader is to go through those: create, advance, represent, and embed. Different emphasis depending on the situation you find yourself in. But as a leader, if you're doing that, you're going to bring everyone together, and you're going to give everyone a voice, and you're going to harness the collective, the collective goodness of that group to the best possible advantage.
And I think, again, just to recap, so creating, advancing, representing us, and embedding us as being that CARE model. And that gives you, presumably, in the introduction to social identity theory. So this is creating a different identity for the team. Is that where we're heading?
So it is. It's based upon this central identity. So let me just jump into a little bit of social identity theory, because I think it's useful. So the science that underpins it is based around both a sense of belonging and a sense of identity. So we all know that humans need to belong. They have a physiological need to survive and be protected and to eat, and they need a psychological element with it as well to be able to thrive. So humans need to belong. But also they have this sort of strong sense of identity. And at the individual level, we have in our brains an operating system based on our belief systems, which is telling us how we are to behave at a given time. So if you think about this in terms of a Venn diagram, Jeremy, you have this, we're neurologically programmed, if you like, to have an individual, need to be different, need to be individual, and also this human requirement to belong to a group. And those two are in tension with each other in your brain at all times. But where there is crossover, you get what's called identity fusion, where the needs of the individual are less important than the needs of the group. And we see this a lot in the military, which is why people do incredibly brave things and sacrifice themselves to the greater benefit of the group. So what the research that we got involved with in the Centre of Team Excellence talked about, it was with the University of Sussex, and they collaborated to look at how identity impacts performance. They use sports teams, Jeremy, to do this. So primarily around sports teams, because there's an agreed outcome. There's winners and losers in sport. In a way, it's a little bit harder to identify in business. And because the research focused on some of the underlying psychological elements, it's transferable across different sectors. So the findings of this research were pretty impressive. The findings were that teams which had a strong identity outperformed those teams with a weaker identity by about 53%.
Significant.
significant. And actually, that was not just significant in terms of actual results. There was a perceived element to it as well. So people were feeling successful as well as actually delivering results. And then of that change, 89% was down to 5 factors. And it's those 5 factors which form the basis for the tribe protocol, which I know we're going to talk about.
So let's talk about that. That's it. Let's talk about that now, because I'm fascinated by that kind of team before self and how it can translate into corporate. Because for those of us who've only ever worked in corporate, I think it can feel like a very individualist environment, and takes some work to get out of that, because we have all of that programmed from an early age to get better, to aspire to better things, and that can be very individualistic. So you mentioned tribe as another reference point. What does tribe mean, and how is that introduced into the corporate arena, Ewen?
Okay, so tribe stands for traditions, relevance, identity, belonging, and effectiveness. And those 5 elements are mapped across to the 5 elements I've just explained, provided 89% of the variance in this research conducted by the University of Sussex. So just walking through each one a little bit. So the T is for tradition. So this is about, connecting a team's past, its present, and its future to provide this continuity over time. So you do something like a simple timeline exercise. This is, mapping the history of the company, 20 years, 50 years, whatever it is, to identify the positives and the negative things that happened. And you get to an assessment really of why we are as we are, why we exist today. It really gets to the heart of the DNA, and it allows you to really reuse the successes and make sure you learn from those areas which didn't go quite well. So that's the sort of tradition. Relevance, as we know, is just about having a clear purpose and making sure alignment is there. Something we talked about already. This is the why behind the what. And I love Simon Sinek's work. He talks about a just cause. I often talk about a noble quest. This is something more than your mission statement. This is really the galvanizing force of
this is the why you do it. This is the why you do it. Why you
100%. So that's where you get your relevance from. You then have your identity, which is your distinctive characteristic. Some people call this ethos, which of course we all know is what a group does and how it does it. And some in the Royal Marines have a very strong ethos. But this is where you're deriving your competitive advantage relative to other providers. So you might be making the same product or providing the same service as other people, but you're doing it in a distinct way, and it's capturing that. Belonging is about how we interact with each other, how we feel included, how we express our expectations, and it usually manifests itself in the values and standards. And then finally, you have the effectiveness, which is all about, your organizational confidence and competence to be able to, leverage your strengths. And the very simple exercise we do, Jeremy, is we whether it's a day or two or a couple of half-day sessions, whatever we have available with the client and the organization, we go through a tribe canvas exercise. So the output of this is literally a one-pager with 5 boxes on it: the T, the R, the I, the B, and the E, with statements or pictures. And I've seen all sorts of creativity in these, but it's an agreed understanding of who we are, why we exist, what our USP and identity is, how we're going to behave with each other, and what are our core strengths, all on one bit of paper. And of course, the value of this is not just in the fact that this is a tangible output from a workshop. The process itself of having the conversations and agreeing how it all works is just as important as the output. It forces prioritization. It gives a shared reference point for people, and it's particularly useful actually in the world of mergers and acquisitions. Because what you're then doing is you're sitting down with 2 groups of people who have both slightly different backgrounds, and you're going to fuse them into one tribe going forward. This is the way we're going to interact going forward. So it's a very empowering framework which can act as a foundation for building the high performance, and then people can hold each other accountable to it going forward.
I think it's a really interesting point that you made there around culture and M&A, because in my background, I did an awful lot of M&A work. I think more than 25 transactions that I led on as an executive, and some of them didn't work.
Yep.
Unfortunately, they didn't cripple any of the organizations that I was working with. But looking back on that process now, the it was a complete red flag in terms of the culture and the way that people work with each other that made the acquisitions fail. And interestingly enough, I have a friend of mine going back 30 odd years now who actually does due diligence in exactly the way that you described there, around the way that people behave. So we can tick off the financial due diligence, we can tick off the commercial, the market, the competitive sectors, but he actually has a specialization which looks at the way that people behave and whether these management teams will be able to work together, or if, for example, they're going to from a group setting to an NBO setting as well, and whether they'll be able to cope with that and what changes of behavior. And going back to one of the points you raised earlier, and that purpose, I find it incredibly helpful now as a non-executive to try and help people put my coaching and mentoring hat on. I think it's crucial for any individual sitting around a boardroom table to be there as a representative of the whole of the business and not just their subject matter expertise. And that it feels like I get far more out of that than perhaps you should. But that first step to be thinking, I'm representing the whole of the business with clear terms of reference for the board or the ELT or the SMT or whatever that forum's called, to be able to say, what am I here to do? If it's a 3-hour meeting, what am I here to do? What am I challenged with? What's my vision, mission, and values? So that fits really well with what you described in terms of tribe and your previous care model as well. And Sinek is someone who I reference a lot in the work that I do with individuals and teams also.
And Jeremy, I find it quite interesting that nowadays a lot of non-executive adverts are really asking for individuals to man mark the executive functions, be it finance or HR or technology, and not providing that holistic view at the board level. I think that's something that, if you're going to be truly independent and offer that broader experience, sometimes that's lost because of a reluctance to move away from the traditional functions.
I see that as well. When you're looking at specifications, again, we're sort of moving into an interesting area, but I see that a lot. And I think what's the output of that? The outputs for that are fairly obvious when you see it in action, because it means you just have a binary conversation between two people. You have a finance-based non-executive speaking across the table, for example, to the finance-based executive, with other people literally looking clueless because it delves into some of the detail, when people should be thinking about the impact of whether it be learning and development or sales or marketing or commercial operations. So I think that really fits well with that. Have you seen it work? How do people respond to that? Going back to one of the earlier points I raised, people are a bit reticent sometimes to take this on board. Does that work? Do people take it on board? And I guess the proof is in the results, isn't it? If it seemed to be working, I guess there'll be a lot more engagement. But I'm assuming that people buy into this.
Yeah. So Jeremy, you use the word reticence. I would use the word skepticism. I think sometimes as a coach and a consultant, you have to overcome that. And lines like "we've done this before and nothing's changed," or "we're too busy, it's not a priority" is another one I hear.
Right.
Or even just people are worried about the fact that it's going to be uncomfortable or slightly exposing. So
absolutely,
of course that happens. So this is where you have to have a conversation about ROI. That dreaded return on investment. And I always start the conversation by saying, what are the outcomes that you actually want to achieve? Because outcomes can be qualitative, but they can also be quantitative. And I think it's really important to differentiate between the two. And of course, Jeremy, you and I both know that in a coaching context, contracting is really important too. And I don't mean legal contracting. I mean just how we are going to work with each other from team coach to group or to individual. What is our professional relationship going to be? How much do you want me to challenge and the like? So you need to make sure you've got the psychological safety there, which will overcome one of those bits of skepticism I alluded to. And you need to set up the contracting really successfully and be really, really clear on what those outcomes are.
I'm glad you referenced that, because it's exactly what I found. And as I mentioned, the evaluation of coaching and mentoring was something that was really important to me when I was doing my own master's degree, because I saw it as being a barrier to entry into an organization, whether it be an individual or an organization, because there would be the perhaps legacy questions like, what do I get back from this? So I chose to research that for a healthy period of time, specifically because there was no consensus, and that's exactly what I found. There's no practitioner or academic consensus around how to do that, and the answer to it, fast forward 12 months through the research work, was contracting and engagement right up front. What outputs and expectations are you expecting to get? And quite frankly, if the first or the second or even the third question I get asked is, how much is this going to cost? You're probably already potentially not going to be able to work with me, because if that's so important up front as to what's the immediate investment. But if you can actually, I've actually done this myself, I've created an evaluation model which simply just maps back what you expect to get out of this, when do you expect to achieve it, with which groups are you hoping to work with. So a lot of common ground, I think, in the work that we do. How does it manifest itself in the team? So, for example, and I see this sometimes when working with founders and entrepreneurs, where the team is incredibly loyal to each other. And I'm thinking of one particular instance where some of the team couldn't move any further. So they'd embraced the culture, they'd embraced the environment, but quite frankly, this was a business that needed more skills in particular areas. And some of those team members couldn't progress. They'd been supported, they were great people, but they couldn't progress further. How do we deal with that in a corporate environment where sometimes the ceiling's been reached? Does this tribe and care model as well enable you to deal with the situations where it isn't going to work out for everybody?
Yeah. If I may just come back to the point we're making, then I promise I'll answer that question. The point we're making about ROI and outcomes, I think I see this almost in a 3-column format, Jeremy. And I often refer to it as my past, present, and future. So my past as a coach or a consultant is my background and my experience. The interventions that we're going to do together is the present, but it's the future outcomes that we're going to co-create together, which is where the value conversation needs to have. And you need to start on the right-hand side of that model and move back to the left. And as you say, whether it's cost or whether it's, I need you to turn up 2 days a week to do this, if you're having that sort of conversation, then it's the wrong conversation, because people need to be focused on the outcomes. So to answer the question, though, back to sort of where there are challenges in this group, because people do move at different speeds, don't they, in a team environment, and that's where I think team coaching can be really, really helpful, because you can, for me, team coaching is different from team development, because team coaching is about performance in context, as opposed to team development, which feels a bit more directive, and it feels a bit more as though you are imparting your knowledge and experience through workshops. Whereas team coaching is, you're involved on the sidelines, but you're able to intervene and interject. And therefore you can call stuff out which is not being called out by other people in the group. And you can force those conversations, those under the table conversations, to come up onto the table. And if you do this if you create the right environment amongst the group, this actually starts to happen on a peer-to-peer basis. And those individuals that are not quite making the grade, or they're either going to be brought along by the rest of the group, or the rest of the group is then going to feel that they're no longer contributing in a meaningful way because they won't be meeting the expectations of the charter, which has been agreed by the group. So some of it might be performance related, some of it might be behavior related. But the answer to your question is they then self-police it. So it doesn't just have to be a really difficult conversation where the CEO talks to individuals, because it's becoming apparent. And they themselves, if they're remotely self-aware, will realize that they are struggling to meet the expectations of the group, the us, individually, and then they will either seek more support from the outside or they'll realize that something needs to change on their side. I think that's a really helpful way to think about it.
And really visible as well in terms of the other activities which we undertake as individuals as well. And we've mentioned sport a number of times, and I particularly focus upon cricket and football, and I know your sport is rugby. But I hear phrases like the dressing room polices itself. You know, the manager of a football team doesn't need to call things out because the 11 players or the squad members have done it for them. They've seen people needing help, they've seen people slacking, or they've seen people outperforming and want to recognize that as well. And I see that kind of all the time in terms, and you can see that as you said. So that, where's the evidence? And you answered this earlier on, Ewan. When you see a stronger, the body language, you can see it. The people celebrating with each other, you can see it evidently in sports teams as well. But a challenge sometimes to do it in the corporate arena. So, Ewan, how do we find out more?
Sorry, can I just come back on that? So I agree, and that the essence of what you've described there, where it's called out, it's mutual accountability, Jeremy. And in the military, we were extremely strong on that, because ultimately in the military, lives were at stake. So if people were not pulling their weight, they were putting other people's lives at risk. And when you have that strong bounding force, you know, everyone holds each other to account. Now, of course, in the corporate world, you know, there's no lives being lost, and the stresses and pressures are not quite at the same level. But that peer-to-peer responsibility, it's the responsibility of each of us to hold all of us to account. And the analogy I like to use when I'm team coaching is the difference between a sports skills coach or a PT coach. You know, you go to a personal trainer to get fit, or you go to a skills coach to improve your, you know, kicking skills. But actually, a performance coach watches you play the game and then helps coach you in the context of that game live with other people around you. You know, so it's in context, and that's really the difference here. That's the only way that people will then become self-reliant and learn and grow themselves and know how to do their decision making, because you've given them the tools, but then you've allowed them to do it in a group and context environment, and that's really important.
Some terrific analogies there, Ewan. So thank you for sharing those. And where do we find more about tribe, about social identity work that you do, and social identity theory, and understanding more about your care model, because you deliver this into corporates? How do we find out more, and how do we contact you, Ewan?
So the best way to contact is through LinkedIn. I'm sort of increasing my profile on there, as we all realise that that's an important part of the modern world. But the Centre of Team Excellence has a great website which you can go directly to on the World Wide Web. But really, any sort of coaching, team coaching, individual coaching, or tribe is a really good model for starting these conversations and holding each other to account. And if you feel that you just need a little bit of glue in which to make your team that little bit more cohesive, then we're for you. Equally, it might be for a complete new team. Equally, it might be for something in the sort of merger and acquisition space. It has utility across the piece. So we're very happy to help if people are interested.
And you and I would add to that by saying, in researching those models for this particular discussion, I as well have found it absolutely fascinating to think, if you were just starting from almost from a complete new beginning, and taking your phrase as well, I called it reticent, you called it skeptical, for just starting from a position of I'm not sure where I'm going yet, but I need to start somewhere. That ability to just start and using that tribe model came across as really quite powerful. to me. So thank you, Ewan, for explaining that to us. And thank you again for another masterclass, Ewan, on the back of your first one a few months ago. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and experience in the military and in the corporate arenas again with us, with your knowledge of leadership, coaching, culture, and in particular for this one, team building. My privilege to speak with you again. You, thank you so much again for your time. I hope you may even offer us a third edition at some point in the future, in and amongst all your other activities well. But thank you once again, Ewan, for your time and energy and your fantastic insights today.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. It's been great to be here.
Great to see you again. Thank you again, and bye for now.